people. So I don't know what same-gendered people. But if any of our listeners who are letting me know about these things know, what does an intersex person do when it comes to gender? Are they assigned one? Do they get to pick one? How does that work? I don't know. Well, this is Doug Pagitt Radio, and we're in a conversation with theologian Anthony Jones, who has put together a set of blog questions that haunt Christianity. Wants to know what your haunting questions are.
Hey, Tony, so you've said that, there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to questions about the Bible and whatnot. So aren't you just using this as a way to kind of, undo what everything has been nicely packaged and has been, thoroughly researched? Aren't you just trying to undo all of that stuff just so that you can reformulate it with your own kind of liberal progressive shtick?
I get the same question from our atheist friends. When I'm on with the atheists, they're like, well, that's not what Christians think, right? So when they push back and they say something, they raise and I say, well, there's other ways that people think about this that to me sounds much more interesting. They're like, well, that's not what any other Christian thinks.
Yeah, I hear that too, and that's what you and I both know is that that's untrue. I mean, they may think that, but
that's
they're
right.
wrong about that. Atheists are wrong about a lot of things, and that's one of the things they're wrong about. So, I mean, I'll just say that earlier this year I released a little ebook on the atonement. There's no doctrine that's been more raked over and worked on and everything else than that. That issue has been dealt with definitively by the church once and for all.
It's done.
It's been done. It's done.
Yeah.
And yet I released that book and thousands of copies sold, and I'm getting it was a collection of blog posts, that I fashioned into a book and whatever. I'm getting speaking engagements now based on that. Will you come talk about the atonement to our church? Because even though it's been done, a lot of people thought they didn't know there was any alternative to the penal substitutionary theory of the atonement.
So when they see these different views, they're like, I thought there was one view and I dismissed it and that was it.
Right, and so I'm bringing up, one of the things I'm doing is, raising the minority report. Who reads the minority report of the Supreme Court, right? The minority opinion.
Yeah.
And I'm bringing up, some of the minority opinions.
Mm-hmm.
And so people can be like, and the reason something became the majority opinion is not necessarily because it was the best answer. A lot of times it's very political. And so I think one of the things hopefully I can do, because I have the background in church history and stuff, is to bring to light some of the, less well-known versions of answers. And who knows? I mean, maybe I stumble upon something where I actually, as a theologian, contribute something new or original to a question.
How do you think it's going to go overall? Do you think mostly you're going to need to come up with fresh answers, or do you think for the most part you're going to be able to sort of dig through the pre-made selections and come up with a decent response?
I think what I'll want to do for the most part is talk about, here's how this question's been traditionally answered, but here's what I really think is going on here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, will they be fully original? I'm not going to be so arrogant as to argue that they're going to be fully original, but I want to bring originality to the task. I mean, we live in a world where the thinking patterns are a lot different for us these days than they were in the Middle Ages, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe one of the things I did, on the atonement thing, is I was able to combine a couple aspects of the atonement that, as far as I know, nobody had combined really before, and say that I think these two fit together really well, and together they maybe trump penal substitutionary atonement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
all right. Well, tell us about this prayer book you're doing. You're putting together a book on why pray. Is it still called Why Pray?
Yeah, that's what I've called it. I run into more and more people who share my own sentiment that it's tough to come up with a justification for prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Really, you think there's a divine being who's sitting around waiting for us to ask for something so that he can do something on our behalf?
Uh-huh.
Or so he can ignore us and not do the thing we asked for? And I get a lot of the if you think prayer is just asking God for things, you have a really limited version
All right,
of prayer,
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah,
Isn't
of course. But primarily the biblical witness to prayer is one of like interceding and asking God for stuff. That's mainly what people do, or for themselves. And God responds, or God doesn't respond. I mean, prayer is interaction with, communication with, and interaction with the divine. It's not meditation. I mean, the big fork in the road for me is, on the one hand, people are like, the more liberal among us, right, our more progressive friends. When I ask them, do you think prayer changes God? They'll say, oh, no, prayer changes me. Prayer doesn't change God. Well, I'm like, well, be a Buddhist. You don't need a divine being if it doesn't change God, if it only changes you. Just what purposes does a deity serve? If the deity isn't somehow interacting with you and making things happen as a result of that.
Yeah, you might as well be talking into the clown's mouth, a Jack-in-the-Box.
Yeah, right. I mean, you might as well be shouting at the universe. I mean, it doesn't matter. If it's about you, then prayer is purely therapeutic. And that's fine. That's totally fine. I mean, I get that prayer is therapeutic, right? There are like medical reports on people who pray heal faster and have less hospital days and things like that. So it is therapeutic. But that's not a reason to pray, unless for a Christian who believes in a divine being that has some kind of interaction with us.
So where do you think this is going to is it going to end? Is it going to end with
Well, the other fork in the road is people who pray for a spot at the mall, at the shopping mall, for a good parking spot, and that's not like, I can't swallow that version of prayer either. That God's like sitting around waiting, like if only you would, if only you would pray more, then God, then God, if you had calluses on your knees or whatever, all those, all those pietistic guilt trips that we were given as children, that God is just waiting around to bless you if you would only pray. And that's a crappy reason to pray too. Like, what kind of deity is sitting around handcuffed like, oh, if only they would pray, I would shower blessings upon them.
Yeah, until then, you get nothing.
Right. Which we just know, like, by empirical evidence is not true. Crappy things happen to Christians and wonderful, miraculous tumors disappear with atheists. Like, there's no one-to-one correlation between if you pray, your tumor disappears. It's just like a crapshoot.
So will there be any?
Pretty hopeful.
Is there any scripture at all in this book? I was just,
There's a lot of scripture. The problem with, like what Jesus says is bug God until God gives you what you want. That's like Jesus' primary teaching about prayer. Go to this guy's house in the middle of the night and ask for a loaf of bread. And he says, this is the parable, right? You bang on the window and the guy says, no, go away. It's the middle of the night. You bang on the window again. I really need a loaf of bread. And the neighbor says, my windows are locked. Everyone's in bed. My whole family's been put to sleep. Come back in the morning. You bang on the window again. Say, I need a loaf of bread. And the guy's like, okay, I'll give you a freaking loaf of bread just to get you out of my hair.
Right. So
this is what prayer is like.
This
Jesus
is what prayer
says.
is like. Yep.
So be persistent. Keep bugging God, and ultimately you'll get the loaf of bread.
See, but doesn't this question of prayer, doesn't it? Because of the insolvables that you've brought up, right? Like you got two forks in the road, and either one of them you take, you're in real trouble. Unless you have a changed view of deity. Like, isn't that where this is going to go? That either it's all just, mythos, or what it means to be God isn't a deterministic view of God. In other words, God doesn't just demand and command things. So when one prays, doesn't it invoke God on your behalf? And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. Doesn't it really point to that? Like the thing that bugs people is, well, if God's God, then God can do whatever God damn well pleases, right? That's sort of the assumption.
Right.
So then if you pray and God doesn't do it, well, then you got yourself a problem. And a lot of people don't like to have a powerless God, right? That's like sort of in on it with you, and, is the T-ball,
no better than you,
is the T-ball coach that has to go sit down, at the pizza party afterward and say, well, we did what we could, but they were that was quite a duty. But isn't a version of that one of the options, right? That you have an interdependent God that has to also that is also affected by the rules of things.
Yes, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you go further down that road than I do. Than I feel comfortable going down that road. I'm interested in
speaking of that phrase. We're going to talk about that in a minute with this song.
First of all, I'm interested in a somewhat classical conception of God. Like I think that process theology is a cop-out, ultimately. I think it answers the question too easily by completely redefining who God is in relation to over against the vast sweep of Christian history and even the Bible. Really, I just don't think I don't see how these process theologians accord their view of. Now you could say, well, the Bible is no longer relevant to me. I'm not a biblical Christian, and that's fine. But like, for me, the challenge is what's interesting to me about it, and the challenge is to take the way that God is talked about in the Bible, and try to make it jibe with a modern sensibility of how things work in the universe.
See, and I'm not a card-carrying process theologian, but I think they're onto some things, and I would suggest that better comports the process theology and an interdependent God better comports with the way God's talked about in the Bible.
That's what they say too.
Than the classic view.
That's what they say too, and I find it unconvincing.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
That's why you have this prayer problem.
Yeah, anytime. Well, no, I've heard process theologians talk about prayer, and I can tell you this. That their answer of prayer will never be compelling for a vast majority of human beings.
Have you heard him prayer? That's a big honor.
That's right.
I mean, it's.
I think that's
true.
What I'm
saying?
Yeah.
I think most people would be like totally unconvincing. That doesn't.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's probably true.
So I'm interested.
In fact, I would say the whole notion of an interdependent God is not a top-notch selling point for most religious people.
Right.
Unfortunately. Now
they want. Yeah. I do think God is somehow other than creation. Now, I think you're right. In the book on prayer, I'm going to have to. Ultimately, the book on prayer is a foil, right, for me to be able to talk about who God is and how God interacts with the world.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Isn't that ultimately where you have to go in any book on prayer? It's really not about prayer,
for me, but it's also about how human beings interact with that God. And I think prayer has something to offer us. I just haven't quite figured out what it is yet. That's what I'm doing in the book, is trying to set up the problem and then solve the problem. I'm still only in the set up the problem part, so I'll come back in a few months.
So do you think there's a way to read the Bible through that very lens, that the Bible is a collection of the stages and ways that people have sought to answer that question based on the experiences of the communities of faith that they're involved in, right? So, Hebrew people, and then the Israelites, and then the people caught in exile, and then a Jesus-y kind of community, and then a post-Jesus-y resurrection community where you're like, well, now we got this issue to deal with. So how does God interact with the world? Like, do you think that's fair to say, well, so a current day explanation of prayer fits into the arc that comes from Scripture, or?
Sure. I don't have any problem saying that the biblical witness is a primitive tribal people's record of how they understood God, and it is therefore more primitive than ours.
Yeah.
That's horribly offensive to a lot of Christians to say that about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And the Jews were
especially
super
if the word primitive there means
less enlightened.
Yes, less quality.
And I think we know more about the way the universe works than they did.
Sure. But what's intriguing is living with a natural health person, primitive doesn't mean less than. It means more pure. It's really interesting.
I don't think that.
Right. Well, yeah, I know.
Other people do. Sure.
Well, yeah, but there is a sense in which there's a
corruption that happens over time.
Yeah, that something primitive has this lasting sensibility to it.
You can either
That doesn't
choose to
need to
believe
be.
that things are generally getting better, and I think you and I are both
Which
in
I
that
do.
camp.
Which I do, yes.
Or you
sure.
can generally think that things are getting worse. And there are a lot of primitivist health people, and there are a lot of primitivist biblical scholars
Sure.
and Amish people
Yeah.
who think that things are degrading. I don't think they're degrading. I think
Yeah.
they're getting better.
Yeah.
But, people who think they're getting worse will probably dismiss the whole premise of my book, which is we need to take a fresh look on
Sure.
prayer because of what we know about how the universe works now.
Right. And I'm not, right. And I'm not suggesting that primitive needs to mean
More
that
pure.
or that it was better,
Right.
and now it's gotten
But
worse.
some people do think that.
I do, yes, for sure they do, and that's where I think there's the need to tease out something that's a little more of a mix, in this running world that I'm in, to move to more primitive running style is the thing that this barefoot running is all about, right? So it's, in one sense it's more primitive, and in the other sense it's realizing the wisdom that was there. So I think there's a way to grant a primitive view, which is on time, right, based on when someone had these ideas. That doesn't have to diminish them. As sort of a sub point to the whole issue.
You could say in that regard, well, you kind of have to make a choice. You say, well, the Israelites, they understood something about God that I don't understand about God because they saw a cloud every day and a pillar of fire every night. That's how close they were to God.
Yeah.
They woke up in the morning and there was manna all over the ground.
Right.
So clearly, I don't see God in a pillar of fire.
Uh-huh.
So they see something. Or you can say they didn't really see God in a pillar of fire. That's the story they told themselves
Right.
years later to
Right.
help their children understand their history.
Yeah.
You have to make that determination.
Right, or at least you're given the choice to make that determination, right? Yeah, I mean, you that's an option, right? Is that it's factual without being, actual, or that's actual without being factual. That little preaching thing. That preaches. So your book is on prayer is going to be available to people when do they get Tony's hopeful prayer book?
Probably early 2014.
Early 2014.
I'm
Is this
guessing
going to be
January.
something that you're going to tease out like you did the Atonement book? Are you going to leak it bits and pieces at a time?
I'm not
going to
give it away. I'm not going to give away the ending.
Yeah.
But I've blogged quite a bit about it, and I'll continue to.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a couple surveys on my blog, and I've gotten hundreds and hundreds of anonymous, or not anonymous necessarily, but private responses, not in the comment section, but people through surveys answering questions about why they do or do not pray. And it's just amazing. I have pastors have written me to say they don't pray. They fake it on Sunday morning. They don't believe in the efficacy of prayer, but it's part of their job, so they just do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
I
other
think that's
peop-
really common.
And other people who have not a scintilla of doubt because they had this one prayer answered this one time that was so profound that they will never again doubt the power of prayer.
Yeah.
So, it's all over the map. It's really interesting the way people interact with that.
Has any of it changed your way of thinking about prayer yet?
Well, I think I'm generally
Where are you
becoming
at?
more hopeful about prayer. I don't
Really?
I don't really pray.
Yeah.
Because I don't really see I'm too much caught in the conundrum of why would you do it? It doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to do anything. It doesn't seem to do what the Bible says it's going to do.
Yeah.
But the more I get into it, of course, it's always affecting when you meet people who are really committed to it, and they're like, "No, prayer works." Let me tell you, because you can't dismiss someone's. Well, you can if you're like Sam Harris, right?
Yeah, and
you can just dismiss people's
just a fool.
experience, right? And just go, "Well, you're just playing mind games on yourself." I can't do that. When people tell me about answered prayer, I take it seriously. It just hasn't happened to me.
Yeah. Are you going to tease out at all the relationship of prayer and blessing? A blessing spoken to someone?
Yeah, I'm going to have to deal with the fact that prayer is more than just asking God to do stuff for you.
I heard this thing in this a book the other day where the person made a distinction by saying prayer is one's communication with God. Blessing is one's communication with the light of God in another person. That's a nice way to think about it, right? Like that's a different kind of prayer. And that sometimes, because we've both picked on, because we've been in enough religious environments where really what you have going on in a prayer meeting is a person giving a speech to another person with their eyes shut, right? And sort of acting like they're talking to God, but they're talking to somebody in particular, where they want to speak a blessing on them, but they do it by saying, God, I want you to do this thing for this person, knowing the person's sitting right there. So what they're really doing is kind of speaking a blessing. And I wonder if some of the angst around prayer that people feel is because they still want there to be a spiritual blessing to somebody. Like they don't want to give up on what they know to be a reality of that, whether or not God hears it and there's a God that acts or doesn't act, really doesn't seem to be most people's functional prayer anyway, right? Like their prayer is for their kids and for their family and for the world, and they have all of these, they want these things to happen. And if talking to God about it sort of makes that a go, I mean, I guess there's the people. I don't think
that's true.
I think there's people in the private prayer life, but any publicly spoken prayer.
Yeah, the vast majority of prayer. I hear what you're saying, and I don't dismiss the fact that probably a lot of people you and I know, that's kind of how they pray. But the vast majority of prayer that's done is private, and the vast majority of those prayers are people who really want God to do something. Like if they're praying for their children, they really want God to intercede and like get their kid off drugs or make sure their kid is safe when they're backpacking through Europe. They really want God to safeguard their child. They think that their prayer activates something in the universe by which God does that.
By which that's going to happen.
So therefore,
you want to take that away from people.
I mean, it just means that means God is time bound to time. That means God is contingent on human behavior. That means, you start to unravel that thing, right? And like all the big theological questions.
Yes. I think you're right. I think they all come up. I mean, I think a whole notion of a changed notion of time, space-time, and other things, where time is not a linear activity. So something happened in the past and it affects the future. And in the future, you can remember the past, but you can never go the other way. You could never remember the future or affect the past, is something that scientists are now telling us that lived experience that's told you that that's how the world makes sense. That's not necessarily how the world functions. Right. That's really interesting stuff around prayer, right? Like,
why not pray for, like, your grandma died of cancer last year, but God's not bound by time. Yeah. So why don't you pray God heals her of cancer? Yeah. And maybe not in your experience, but in some alternate universe, God heals her of cancer before she dies. Yeah, yeah. Or brings her back to life, because in that universe, that's common and possible.
Or maybe it's not just God that's not bound by. Maybe none of us are bound by time. Yeah. Like this whole. So this is what it then raises. It seems to me is this whole notion.
Are we gonna talk about this song?
Do you want to?
Over?
Okay. I know. I kind of. Well, sometimes we make people wait for weeks. So this is a very famous song, right, from our childhood, right? And this is a little song called "If You Believed in Miracles, So Would I."
That's not the song.
Oh, that's the song.
Oh, yeah, it is the song.
I was struck because I picked this out for the radio show on a previous one, and then I like to look up the words to songs. This is one of the things that, it's what I like to do. The words are, I knew you and had but one heart. Only our bodies were apart. That was so easy, that I had a taste of the real world when I went down on you, girl. If only you believe in miracles. I'm not even kidding. Listen to this. Here it is.
So it's an anthem to cunnilingus? Is that what it is?
It is It is unbelievable. I mean, the number of times when I was a kid, and I would have had no idea.
Oh yeah, singing along
What-
at full volume.
Either what those words were,
Right.
or what they meant. But this is like, well, when you find out what what the good folks of Jefferson Starship were really singing back in their little thing,
Well.
and the whole song stays like that. It's like really, really suggestive. Sort of. I mean, that's the most most intense part. But okay, so that's theologian Tony Jones. Thank you, buddy.
My pleasure.
Glad to have you. And hey, folks, we're going to be back next week. But remember, we're not back on Wednesday live. We're back Tuesday.
Hey, you know what?
11:30 till 1 with Phyllis Tickle in a conversation going on in Memphis, Tennessee.
And you know what didn't happen?
What's that?
Not one person caught swine flu at the state fair, you
That's not true.
fear-mongering.
I was
What?
just going to
Three
say that's
people
not
got
true.
state-
Three
three
people
people.
got
No way.
A different version of swine flu, but they got it in the swine barn.
in the swine barn.
But it was all
At
people
least
who
3 of
spent the
them.
entire day in there.
I don't care. It's going to spread like a contagion
It's
around
not
this world. And you
Chicken Little sky falling, pork apocalypse. You're
How many does it take?
I thought you were a
3?
hopeful, optimistic contrarian.
Oh, I am.
Oh no! The state epidemiologist apparently has divine power and able to predicting this, massive outbreak that was going to happen.
Yeah,
It's
you
the
know-
perfect
I
storm
know, I
of.
heard that.
Do you know who we should stop listening to? Epidemiologists. That's really going to do us. That's really going to do us great. Like
Yes,
if we got to
that's my
call
platform.
If we got to call BS on somebody, let's start with those guys, right? Because what could go wrong there? Yeah, all that hand washing and. Well, we'll be back next week with Phyllis Tickle. It's going to be a blast. Thanks for sticking around. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you, John Music.
Whatever.
And we'll talk with you next week.
Is that your sign off?
Whatever.
That
See
should be
ya.
your sign off. Whatever.
Whatever. Can we eat?